Margaret Thompson adjusted her worn leather briefcase on her lap as the small chartered Cessna Citation climbed through the clouds above Colorado. At 62, she had grown accustomed to these modest flights between her charity work locations, but today felt different. The pilot, a young man named Jake Morrison, seemed unusually tense as he checked his instruments repeatedly. Margaret had spent the last 3 decades running a nonprofit organization that provided educational resources to underprivileged communities across the American Southwest. Her weathered hands told the story of countless hours spent building schools, organizing book drives, and personally delivering supplies to remote areas that larger organizations had forgotten. She dressed simply in a navy cardigan and sensible shoes, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had dedicated her life to service rather than recognition. The turbulence hit suddenly, causing her to grip the armrest as Jake's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mrs. Thompson, we've got some unexpected weather ahead. Nothing to worry about, but we might need to adjust our altitude." She nodded, used to these minor complications that came with flying in small aircraft to reach isolated communities. What Margaret didn't know was that 30 minutes earlier, air traffic control had lost contact with their aircraft due to a radio malfunction. The transponder had also failed, making their small plane appear as an unidentified aircraft on radar screens. In the current climate of heightened security, protocol demanded immediate investigation of any aircraft that deviated from its flight plan without communication. At Peterson Air Force Base, Colonel Rodriguez received the alert with practiced efficiency. An unidentified aircraft flying erratically through restricted airspace triggered automatic protocols. Within minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors were scrambling, their pilots briefed on a potential security threat. The military's response was swift and decisive, as it had been trained to be in an era where aerial threats could materialize from seemingly innocent sources. Major Sarah Williams and Captain David Chen climbed into the cockpit of their respective F-22s, running through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. Neither pilot knew they were about to intercept a grandmother whose greatest weapon was her ability to organize bake sales, and whose most dangerous mission involved delivering textbooks to children in rural Wyoming. As the fighter jets roared into the sky, Margaret continued reading a report about literacy rates in Native American communities, completely unaware that she was about to become the center of a military operation. The irony wasn't lost on the universe that a woman who had spent her life fighting ignorance and poverty through education was now being pursued by two of the most sophisticated killing machines ever created. The collision of two worlds was about to begin, and neither side was prepared for what would unfold in the next few hours. Margaret's simple charter flight would soon become a story that would be retold in military academies and congressional hearings for years to come, all because of a few failed electronics and a chain of miscommunications that would reveal just how thin the line between security and paranoia had become. Margaret felt the first vibration through the aircraft's frame as the F-22s approached from behind, their powerful engines creating turbulence that Jake immediately recognized as something far more serious than weather. His face paled as he checked his radio equipment again, frantically trying to establish contact with air traffic control while watching two dark shapes appear in his mirrors. "Mrs. Thompson," Jake's voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. "We have some company." He gestured toward the left window where Margaret could see a sleek gray fighter jet maintaining perfect formation just off their wing tip. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, the F-22's angular design making it look like something from a science fiction movie rather than reality. Margaret's first instinct wasn't fear but curiosity. In her decades of community work, she had learned that most situations had reasonable explanations, and she assumed this was some kind of training exercise or escort service she hadn't been informed about. "Are they here to help us?" she asked Jake, who was now sweating despite the cool cabin temperature. Major Williams' voice crackled through the military frequency to her wingman. "Falcon 2, I have visual on the target. Small civilian aircraft, appears to be a citation. Single engine, 2 occupants visible." She maneuvered her F-22 closer, following standard interception protocols while trying to get the pilot's attention through visual signals. The problem was that Jake's radio had completely failed, leaving him unable to communicate with anyone, including the fighter jets that were now flanking his aircraft on both sides. He tried hand signals, pointing desperately at his headset and shaking his head, but the F-22 pilots interpreted this as potential noncompliance or even hostile intent. Captain Chen reported back to base. "Control, target aircraft is not responding to radio calls. Pilot appears agitated, making erratic gestures, requesting further instructions." The tension in his voice was palpable as he maintained his position, knowing that the next few minutes could determine whether this would end as a routine intercept or something far more serious. Margaret watched the military pilots with growing concern, not for her own safety, but for the obvious stress this situation was causing Jake. She had spent enough time in crisis situations to recognize when someone was approaching panic, and she could see that her pilot was struggling to maintain composure. Years of managing emergencies in her nonprofit work had taught her to remain calm when others couldn't. "Jake, take a deep breath," she said in the same steady voice she used when comforting frightened children in disaster zones. "Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out. These pilots are professionals and they're not going to hurt us. Let's think about what they might need from us." The F-22s maintained their escort positions as the small aircraft continued its flight path, creating a surreal scene at 30,000 feet. Margaret Thompson, who had never even received a speeding ticket, was now the focus of a military operation that had cost taxpayers thousands of dollars and involved some of the most advanced technology in the world. What neither side understood yet was that this misunderstanding would soon escalate into something that would test the limits of military protocol and reveal the human cost of a security system that had grown increasingly paranoid in its quest to protect the homeland from threats both real and imagined. Colonel Rodriguez monitored the situation from the command center, watching radar screens that showed the three aircraft maintaining formation. His years of experience told him something was wrong with the standard profile of this intercept, but protocol demanded he treat every unidentified aircraft as a potential threat until proven otherwise. Falcon Leader, this is base control. Target aircraft continues to ignore all communication attempts. Are you observing any signs of compliance or hostile intent? The colonel's voice carried the weight of someone who had made these decisions before, knowing that the wrong call could have catastrophic consequences. Major Williams studied the citation through her canopy, noting the aircraft's steady flight path and the apparent calm of its occupants. Something didn't fit the profile of a security threat, but her training demanded she follow established procedures regardless of her instincts. Base control. Target is maintaining course and altitude. No obvious signs of hostile intent, but also no compliance with intercept protocols. Recommend we attempt to force compliance through standard escalation procedures. Margaret noticed that one of the fighter jets was now flying slightly ahead of their aircraft, with the pilot making deliberate gestures toward the ground. Even without military training, she understood this was likely a command to land, but Jake's face showed the terror of someone who knew they had no choice but to comply with orders they couldn't properly acknowledge. "They want us to land," Jake finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't know what's happening, but these aren't training exercises. They think we're some kind of threat, and I can't talk to them to explain what's wrong with our radio." The weight of the situation began to settle on Margaret as she realized that her simple charter flight had somehow become a national security incident. Her mind raced through the possibilities, trying to understand how a nonprofit director flying to a meeting about childhood literacy could have attracted the attention of the military's most elite fighters. Captain Chen's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Base control, I'm reading some kind of equipment failure on the target aircraft. Their transponder is dark, and they're not responding to any frequency. This might be a communication issue rather than noncompliance." His assessment offered the first glimmer of hope that this situation might be resolved without further escalation. Margaret made a decision that would define everything that followed. She unbuckled her seat belt and moved toward the cockpit, placing a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "Let me try something," she said, reaching for the radio microphone with the confidence of someone who had spent decades solving problems that seemed impossible to others. Her voice, when it came through the static, carried none of the panic or defiance that the pilots had been trained to expect from potential threats. Instead, it held the calm authority of a woman who had spent her life in service to others, and it would soon change everything about how this encounter would unfold. "Hello, this is Margaret Thompson aboard the civilian aircraft. I believe you're trying to communicate with us, but our radio system has failed. We're experiencing equipment problems, not ignoring your instructions. Please tell us how we can help resolve this situation safely." The transmission was scratchy and broken, but clear enough for Major Williams to understand. For the first time since the intercept began, she heard something that didn't fit the profile of a security threat. The voice was elderly, female, and carried the kind of calm reasonableness that suggested this might indeed be a misunderstanding rather than a hostile act. "Base Control, this is Falcon Leader. We're receiving intermittent communication from target aircraft." Female voice, identifying herself as Margaret Thompson, claims equipment failure rather than intentional noncompliance, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Major Williams found herself hoping that this would be the beginning of a peaceful resolution rather than an escalation. Colonel Rodriguez felt the first stirring of doubt about the threat assessment. In his experience, actual security threats rarely involved elderly women who politely introduced themselves and offered to help resolve the situation. "Falcon Leader, can you confirm the nature of the aircraft's mission? We need to verify their identity and flight plan before we can de-escalate." Margaret's voice came through again, stronger this time as Jake managed to boost the radio's power. "We're flying from Denver to Cheyenne for a meeting with the Wyoming Department of Education about literacy programs for rural communities. I'm the director of the Mountain States Education Initiative. Our flight plan should be on file with Denver Approach Control." The simple honesty of her explanation began to shift the entire dynamic of the encounter. Major Williams found herself looking at the small aircraft with new eyes, seeing not a potential threat, but a woman who spent her life helping children learn to read. The cognitive dissonance between the military response and the actual situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Chen's voice carried a note of relief. "Base Control, target aircraft story is checking out. Flight plan shows departure from Denver with destination Cheyenne. Pilot appears to be Jake Morrison, certified commercial pilot, passenger listed as Margaret Thompson. No red flags in the database. The verification process that followed would take several more minutes, but the tone of the entire operation had shifted from potential threat response to what was clearly becoming an embarrassing case of mistaken identity. Margaret Thompson, who had never imagined she would be the subject of a military intercept, was about to discover that her reputation extended far beyond the educational communities she served. Colonel Rodriguez's investigation into Margaret's background would soon reveal why this particular case of mistaken identity was about to become more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The woman they had scrambled F-22s to intercept wasn't just any civilian. She was someone whose connections reached into the highest levels of government and military leadership. Margaret Thompson's voice remained steady as she continued to cooperate with the military pilots, unaware that her name was already being run through databases that would soon reveal connections that would make this intercept a career-defining moment for everyone involved. The background check results began appearing on Colonel Rodriguez's screen within minutes, and what he saw made him immediately understand that this situation required careful handling. Margaret Thompson wasn't just a nonprofit director. She was the widow of General Robert Thompson, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had served with distinction in multiple conflicts before his death from cancer 5 years earlier. More importantly, Margaret had spent the last 15 years working closely with the Department of Defense on educational initiatives for military families. Her organization had provided tutoring services to thousands of children whose parents were deployed overseas, and her work had earned her commendations from 3 different secretaries of defense. Jesus, Colonel Rodriguez muttered under his breath as he read through Margaret's file. She had been a frequent visitor to the Pentagon, had organized literacy programs on military bases across the country, and had been personally thanked by the president for her work with Gold Star families. The woman they had scrambled fighters to intercept was practically family to the military community. Major Williams received the updated information through her secure communication system, and her blood ran cold as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Base Control, please confirm the identity information you just transmitted. Are you telling me we just intercepted the General Thompson's widow? The confirmation came with additional details that made the situation even more delicate. Margaret Thompson had been scheduled to meet with the superintendent of Wyoming schools to discuss expanding her literacy program to include children from F.E. Warren Air Force Base, the state's primary military installation. Her work there would have directly benefited the families of the airmen who had just spent the last hour treating her as a potential terrorist. Captain Chen's voice carried a mixture of relief and horror. Falcon Leader, we need to make this right. Mrs. Thompson has probably done more for military families than most people in uniform. This is going to be a public relations nightmare if it gets out. Margaret, still unaware of the full implications of her identity revelation, continued to handle the situation with the grace that had made her beloved in military communities across the country. "I understand you're all just doing your jobs," she said through the radio. "I know my husband would have appreciated the professionalism you've shown today, even under these difficult circumstances." The mention of her late husband sent a ripple of emotion through the military personnel involved in the intercept. General Thompson had been a legend in certain circles, known for his dedication to his troops and his innovative approaches to counterinsurgency tactics. His widow's continuation of service through education had made her a revered figure among military families. Colonel Rodriguez made a decision that would define how this incident would be remembered. Instead of treating this as a routine intercept that had been resolved, he chose to turn it into an opportunity to honor both Margaret's service and her late husband's memory. "Falcon Leader, I want you to provide Mrs. Thompson with a full military escort to her destination. Consider this a honor guard for one of our most valued civilian partners." Major Williams felt a surge of pride as she understood the colonel's intent. "Copy that, base control. It would be our honor to escort Mrs. Thompson to Cheyenne. Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to provide you with a fighter escort for the remainder of your flight if you'll accept it." Margaret's response revealed the character that had made her so effective in her decades of service. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to cause any unnecessary expense or trouble. I'm sure you have more important things to do than escort an old woman to a meeting about reading programs." The humility in her response only reinforced why she had earned such respect throughout the military community. Here was a woman who had been intercepted by fighter jets due to an equipment malfunction, and her first concern was about inconveniencing the people who had been preparing to force her aircraft down just minutes earlier. Colonel Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with unmistakable warmth. "Mrs. Thompson, after everything you've done for our military families, providing you with a safe escort is the least we can do. Besides, I suspect the airmen at F.E. Warren would be honored to know that their children's advocate arrived with a fighter escort." The transformation of the encounter from potential threat to honor escort would soon become a story that resonated throughout military circles. But Margaret Thompson remained focused on the practical aspects of the situation. She asked Jake about the status of their radio equipment and whether they would be able to maintain communication for the rest of the flight. Jake, who had been silent during most of the identity verification process, finally found his voice. "Mrs. Thompson, I had no idea about your background. I'm sorry you had to go through this because of my equipment failure." Margaret's response demonstrated the compassion that had made her so effective in her work with military families. "Jake, you handled this situation perfectly. Equipment fails sometimes, and that's not anyone's fault. What matters is that everyone stayed professional and safe." The F-22s maintained their escort formation as the small citation continued toward Cheyenne. But the entire dynamic had shifted from interception to protection. Major Williams found herself genuinely honored to be flying alongside someone who had dedicated her life to serving the military community, even if that service came through education rather than combat. As they flew over the Colorado landscape, Margaret reflected on how her husband would have reacted to this situation. Robert had always told her that the military was ultimately about protecting people, not just fighting enemies, and she believed he would have been proud of how professionally everyone had handled what could have been a tragic misunderstanding. The approach to Cheyenne Regional Airport became a carefully choreographed ballet of military precision and civilian aviation. Air traffic control had been notified of the unusual escort, and emergency vehicles were standing by not because of any threat, but because the arrival of F-22s at a civilian airport always required additional safety precautions. Margaret Thompson looked out her window at the fighter jets that had transformed from potential threat to honor guard, and she felt a deep appreciation for the men and women who served their country with such dedication. She had no idea that her grace under pressure and her lifetime of service had just earned her a place in military folklore that would be remembered for generations. As the citation began its descent toward Cheyenne, Margaret prepared for what she assumed would be a routine landing followed by her scheduled meeting with education officials. She had no way of knowing that word of her escort had already reached the highest levels of military command, and that her arrival would be met with a reception that would honor both her service and her late husband's memory. The landing at Cheyenne Regional Airport drew a crowd that Margaret hadn't expected. Word of her fighter escort had spread through military channels, and personnel from F.E. Warren Air Force Base had driven the 20 minutes to the civilian airport to witness the arrival of someone who had become legendary in their community. Major Williams and Captain Chen performed a flyover as the citation touched down, a traditional military salute that brought tears to the eyes of the airmen who had gathered to watch. Margaret Thompson, who had always shunned publicity in favor of quiet service, found herself at the center of a spontaneous celebration of her decades of dedication to military families. Colonel Rodriguez arrived at the airport in his staff car, accompanied by the base commander from F.E. Warren. They had decided that this situation required personal attention from the highest levels of leadership, both to apologize for the misunderstanding and to recognize Margaret's contributions to their community. As Margaret deplaned, She was greeted by a small formation of honor guards and a delegation of officers who had come to personally thank her for her service. The contrast between her simple civilian clothes and the formal military reception created a powerful image of civilian-military cooperation that would soon spread throughout the Defense Department. "Mrs. Thompson," Colonel Rodriguez said as he approached, "I want to personally apologize for the confusion today and to thank you for your grace in handling what must have been a frightening situation." Margaret's response was typical of her character. "Colonel, there's no need to apologize. Your people were doing their jobs and they did them well. I'm grateful for their professionalism and for the safe escort they provided." The base commander from F.E. Warren stepped forward with a presentation that surprised everyone, including Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, we understand you're here to discuss expanding your literacy program to include our military families. We'd like to present you with a token of our appreciation for your years of service to our community." The presentation was a flag that had been flown over F.E. Warren Air Force Base, along with a certificate recognizing Margaret's contributions to military families throughout the region. The ceremony was impromptu but deeply felt, representing the military's recognition of civilian partners who served with the same dedication as those in uniform. Margaret accepted the honors with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to the entire incident. "This is very kind, but I want you to know that the honor has been mine. Working with military families has been the most rewarding part of my career, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue that work." Jake Morrison, who had been largely forgotten during the formal presentations, found himself invited to join the reception as recognition for his professional handling of the equipment failure. The young pilot was still processing the fact that his routine charter flight had become a military incident, but he was grateful for the positive resolution. The meeting with Wyoming education officials that had originally brought Margaret to Cheyenne was transformed into a much larger discussion about military-civilian cooperation in education. The morning's events had demonstrated the importance of communication and understanding between different communities, lessons that would inform the educational programs Margaret was developing. As the formal reception concluded, Margaret finally had a moment to process what had happened. The widow of a career military officer, she understood the delicate balance between security and service that defined military life. Today's incident had tested that balance, but it had also demonstrated the fundamental goodness of the people who served in uniform. Major Williams and Captain Chen landed at F.E. Warren Air Force Base shortly after the ceremony. Their mission transformed from potential threat interception to honor escort. Both pilots would later describe the experience as one of the most meaningful flights of their careers. a reminder that military service was ultimately about protecting people like Margaret Thompson, who made their communities better. The incident report that Colonel Rodriguez would later file would become required reading in military academies, not because of the operational procedures involved, but because of the human elements that had turned a potential disaster into a celebration of service and sacrifice. Margaret Thompson returned to her hotel that evening with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of military life and the dedication of the people who served. She had no idea that her story would soon be shared throughout military circles as an example of grace under pressure and the importance of civilian-military partnerships. The next morning, Margaret's meeting with the Wyoming Department of Education proceeded as scheduled, but with an additional dimension that hadn't been planned. The previous day's events had demonstrated the need for better communication between civilian and military communities, and Margaret's literacy program was uniquely positioned to address that need. The expansion of her program to include F.E. Warren Air Force Base was approved unanimously, with additional funding provided to ensure that military families would have access to the same educational resources available to civilian communities. Margaret's work would now directly benefit the families of the airmen who had escorted her, creating a connection that would last for generations. Word of the incident had reached the Pentagon by morning, and Margaret received a call from the Secretary of Defense's office expressing gratitude for her handling of the situation and her continued service to military families. The secretary wanted to ensure that the incident would not discourage her from her work with military communities. Margaret's response was characteristically humble. "Mr. Secretary, if anything, yesterday's events have reinforced my commitment to serving military families. I saw firsthand the professionalism and dedication of our service members, and I'm honored to continue working with them." The story of Margaret Thompson's Intercept began to spread through military social media and family networks, becoming a symbol of the civilian-military partnership that strengthened American communities. Her grace under pressure and lifetime of service had turned what could have been a public relations disaster into a celebration of American values. Jake Morrison found himself unexpectedly famous within aviation circles, his professional handling of the equipment failure earning him recognition from the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. The young pilot had learned that even routine flights could become extraordinary experiences when handled with skill and professionalism. The F-22 pilots who had participated in the escort found themselves fielding questions from colleagues who wanted to know what it was like to fly alongside someone who had dedicated her life to serving military families. Major Williams and Captain Chen described the experience as a reminder of why they had chosen to serve their country. Margaret returned to her home in Colorado with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the challenges facing military families. Her organization would soon expand its programs to include communication training and cultural exchange programs designed to strengthen civilian-military understanding. The incident had also revealed gaps in communication protocols that needed to be addressed. Margaret worked with military officials to develop procedures that would prevent similar misunderstandings, while maintaining the security measures necessary to protect American airspace. Her work with the Department of Defense expanded to include consultation on civilian-military relations and crisis communication, areas where her experience during the Intercept had provided valuable insights. Margaret's ability to remain calm under pressure and her understanding of both civilian and military perspectives made her uniquely qualified for this work. The annual Conference of Military Family Support Organizations that year featured Margaret Thompson as the keynote speaker, her story serving as an inspiration to hundreds of volunteers who worked to support service members and their families. Her message was simple but powerful. Service comes in many forms, and every contribution matters. Margaret's speech at the conference would later be quoted in military publications and family support materials, her words capturing the essence of civilian-military partnership. We may not wear uniforms, but we serve the same cause. We may not carry weapons, but we fight the same battles against ignorance and isolation. We may not take military oaths, but we share the same commitment to protecting what matters most. The literacy program that had originally brought Margaret to Wyoming expanded beyond anyone's expectations, eventually serving military families across the western United States. The program's success was directly attributed to the understanding and cooperation that had developed from the intercepted flight incident. Margaret Thompson's story became a case study in crisis management and public relations, taught in both military and civilian leadership programs. Her response to an unexpected and potentially dangerous situation demonstrated the importance of clear communication, mutual respect, and shared values in resolving conflicts. The young airmen at F.E. Warren Air Force Base who benefited from Margaret's expanded literacy program would grow up knowing that their education had been championed by someone who had faced down F-22 fighters with nothing but grace and determination. Her story would inspire them to understand that service to country could take many forms. 5 years after the incident, Margaret Thompson was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy's graduation ceremony, her story serving as an example of civilian leadership and military-civilian cooperation. The cadets who heard her speak would carry her message into their own careers, understanding that their service was part of a larger community effort. Margaret's late husband, General Robert Thompson, would have been proud of how his wife had handled the situation that had thrust her into military folklore. Her response to the intercept had demonstrated the same courage and dedication that had defined his own career, proving that service to country was a family tradition that transcended uniform and rank. The final chapter of Margaret Thompson's story was still being written, but her legacy was already secure. She had shown that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges, that grace under pressure was more powerful than any weapon, and that the true strength of America lay in the partnership between its military and civilian communities. Her work continued, touching the lives of military families across the nation and inspiring others to find their own ways to serve. The woman who had been intercepted by F-22s at 30,000 feet had become a symbol of American resilience and the enduring power of quiet, dedicated service to others. Margaret Thompson never sought fame or recognition for her work, but her story had become part of military tradition, passed down through generations of service members who understood that their mission was ultimately about protecting people like her, civilians who made their communities stronger through their dedication and service. The intercept that had begun as a potential security threat had become a celebration of American values, demonstrating that the greatest threats to national security were ignorance and division, while the greatest defenses were education and understanding. Margaret Thompson had spent her life fighting those battles, and her victory over the F-22s had been achieved with nothing more than honesty, grace, and a lifetime of service to others. In the end, Margaret Thompson's story proved that heroism came in many forms, that service to country could be expressed through teaching children to read as powerfully as through military action, and that the true defenders of American freedom were often the quiet, dedicated individuals who worked tirelessly to make their communities better, one person at a time. The woman who had been intercepted by fighter jets at 30,000 feet had shown that the greatest victories were won not through force or intimidation, but through compassion, understanding, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the opportunity to learn, grow, and contribute to the greater good. Her legacy would inspire generations of Americans to find their own ways to serve, ensuring that the values she represented would endure long after her story had become legend.